Okay, so we're picking up here with meditation 4 in our second week of taking a look at Descartes' meditations. Good news, this chapter is quite a bit shorter than meditation 3. In fact, meditation 3, which was the last meditation we looked at last week, of course, is by far the longest, by far the most difficult and the most technical of the whole book. So we are, so to speak, through the woods, through the most difficult part of this subject matter. Okay, so let's go ahead and pick up with meditation 4. The goal here is just going to be to take everything that we've so far accomplished and achieved and realized from the first 3 meditations and apply it to other areas of knowledge. So Descartes starts out here by reminding himself, and of course reminding also his readers, that the idea of his mind as a thinking thing is an idea that's more distinct than any idea of any body whatsoever. So again, think back to the example of the wax candle, and he sits next to it and he's able to identify it as the same thing by way of this idea that's completely mental, right? It's something that is more fixed, more distinct, clearer than any idea that he has of any sort of body. Now, this isn't quite the same thing as realizing that his own mind is the clearest and most distinct idea that he has of all, but it is structurally similar, right? He's getting at the same sort of point here, and this is something that kind of defies so-called common sense. We ordinarily think that maybe intellectual ideas, rational ideas are not quite as certifiable or as guaranteeable as ideas that we have, to use the examples I used last week, of a desk in front of us or the chair upon which you sit, or even your own physical body, your arms, your head, right? You touch yourself on your shoulder with your hand, and it feels to be much more real, doesn't it, than the idea that you have of yourself as an I, or the idea that you have of yourself as an ego or consciousness. But not for Descartes. Descartes will say precisely the opposite. This idea of myself as a thinking thing is something that is clearer and more distinct than any idea that I have of any physical thing. That's all he means when he talks about body. So he'll remind us as well of something else that he has pinned down and decided in this book. He'll say God wouldn't deceive me. God wouldn't give me a faculty for error. And in fact, when I use the faculty of judging properly, I can't actually be wrong. And the reason for this is because I'm given this faculty by God. So if I use it the way that God intended, if I use it properly as he says, then I can be sure of the results that I'm given. The problem is when I use this faculty improperly. That is when the results, that is when the conclusions are far less guaranteed. And here's the problem, right? I still know that I make mistakes. I still know that I make errors. Why does this happen? Why do I judge improperly? Why is this even a possibility if I'm really given this faculty from God? So this is really going to be what he's going to try to answer in this 4th chapter, the subtitle of which, as you'll see at the top, is On True and False. So he says, let's start out by pointing out that the faculty of judgment, the faculty of judging the truth, which is, again, to remind you, something that we were given by God, Descartes claims, is something that is finite, meaning it is not infinite, it is not unlimited, it has limits, it has certain finite capabilities, right? It is not something that is all-powerful. It is not something that is able to achieve absolutely anything, judge any matter whatsoever, right? It is something that is precisely the opposite. It's very limited, and we realize this. So Descartes says, when I'm puzzled by things, right, I don't have to wonder why God set up the world in this way, despite the fact that I'm confused, despite the fact that I have puzzlement or confusion. I don't actually have to wonder why God set the things up in this way. In fact, Descartes will say, to the extent that I am to the extent that I am finite, right, and God is infinite in nature, this makes sense. Meaning, to the extent that I only have a finite intellect and God has an infinite intellect, It makes sense for me to be confused and puzzled about the world. This is something that we should expect. We shouldn't think that this is odd or necessarily a philosophical problem that we'll have to surmount. So what then causes my errors? Descartes will say there's two different things that cause errors: knowing and choosing. And he'll say that there's actually no error in the intellect itself. The intellect can only lack an idea. It can only be ignorant of something. And again, this is because it's finite. So this is something like not being aware of something, right? We wouldn't necessarily say that you're wrong if you don't know what the capital of Monaco is, just to refer back to an example that we used when we were talking about Plato a couple weeks ago. We wouldn't say you were wrong. We would rather say you just lacked an idea. So this is what Descartes calls the first type of error. It's just lacking knowledge. It's not really being wrong. It's not really being incorrect about something in a technical sense. It's just lacking an answer. So there are no real errors then when it comes to knowledge and the intellect. That's what he's saying there. Except for the qualified sort that I just explained, where we have something that you're just not aware of. It comes to the will. It comes to choosing, where we're going to run into our problem, where we're going to see how the really problematic errors arise. This is one of the most surprising things he's going to say in the book. He said that the intellect is finite, the intellect is limited, but Descartes actually insists that your will, not only is it free, but it's infinite. It is unlimited by any restriction whatsoever. And he has an argument for this. He gives proof. He says, I can imagine a more complete intellect than my own. That would be the intellect or mind of God, something that is infinite, knows everything there is to know. But, perhaps surprisingly, I can't imagine a will more complete than my own. I cannot compare my will to God's and say that mine is finite and God's is infinite. It just doesn't make sense as far as Descartes is concerned. And again, I know this is probably something that seems misguided to you. I know a lot of the time, particularly in Christianity, people will say that something happens, in particular, something bad happens because it was God's will. And I think a lot of us assume that in this sort of schema, in this sort of paradigm, what we're saying is that God's will is greater, God's will is more complete or something. But Descartes will say, au contraire, that is not the case. God's will is actually not any greater than mine. The difference between me and God has nothing to do with God's will. So it's, again, something that kind of perhaps is not what you would expect him to say. The idea here, though, is that willing isn't about being able to do things, because of course it's true that God can do things that a human cannot, assuming that God exists. So, for example, let's take the example of Jesus or some other God who was on earth, and let's say that this God is able to fly and that a mere mortal could not do so, or maybe we want to use the example of walking on water, something out of the Bible. Really, it doesn't matter. Just think of anything that a God on earth could do and a human could not. Descartes would say that this isn't actually an example of the God having a greater will than the mortal, than the human. Really, all will is about is freely wanting something. And you can freely want to walk on water, can't you? You can freely want to fly. In fact, a lot of children have this fantasy. It doesn't actually have to do with being able to execute or achieve whatever the outcome is, right? We're just talking about the desire that is in the will itself. And for Descartes, it is totally unlimited. You can dream and wish for and hope for and desire anything out there that you want, completely without limits. But it is neither your infinite will, believe it or not, nor your finite intellect that on its own accounts for the errors that are really concerning in philosophy and in science. Here's what happens. Descartes will tell us exactly where the problem occurs. He says, it is when the will extends further than the intellect that we have these sorts of errors. Descartes says, I extend my will to things that I do not understand. The will easily turns away from the true and from the good, and in this way I am deceived and I sin. So he's not really talking about the sort of sin that's maybe referenced in Scripture, but rather something like a philosophical sin, where you basically are committing a really egregious, let's say, misstep when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to saying that you know something that in fact you do not know. So I'll read that quote one more time. I extend my will to things I don't understand, and my will easily turns away from the true and the good, and in this way I am deceived and I sin. So the idea here, imagine that you are talking to someone who says that they're right about something. Let's just imagine that it's some sort of political or religious belief, because I think these are usually the ones where we have a lot of disagreement, because so many people have different opinions. This other person is basically claiming that they know something that it doesn't seem like they really know. This person is saying something that maybe if we were to ask a scientist or a philosopher or a credible source on the matter, this person would say, no, that's wrong, that's an error. So what is it that happens here? It's not that the person has some issue in their intellect. It's not a rational problem. Rather, Descartes is saying that this person wants to be right. This person desires to be right, desires the true so much that they're actually turning away from the truth. They're actually turning away from what's good. And this is a way of kind of paradoxically deceiving yourself, because you're the one who's responsible for it. And for really hundreds of years, philosophers have really been confused about how on earth it's possible to deceive yourself. How right, it's kind of like a whole and part problem. How can you both be the person who is deceiving and also be the person who is being deceived? It's kind of a tricky little logical problem, but Descartes here will have his own account for how it occurs. So Descartes' going to say, we can't actually avoid being ignorant. We can't avoid not having knowledge of things. And this is the first type of error, again, the type of error that we talk about in the intellect. You don't know the capital of Monaco, or you don't know the atomic number of some element or something, or you don't know some technical fact from the history of philosophy. We can't avoid these types of errors, these sort of minor errors, we can call them. What can we avoid? What type of error should we try to stay away from? Well, precisely the type that I just described on this slide. The type where we make an erroneous judgment, where we extend our will too far, where we want to be right, where we desire to be right, but in extending this intellect, this infinite intellect, this infinite will further than this finite intellect, we turn away precisely from what's true and from what's good. So Descartes says we do have control over this. We can stop this from happening. So what would be proper? This is Descartes' recommendation for us. He says we should hold off from making a judgment when we don't perceive what is true by way of a clear and distinct perception. Again, remember, that's his criterion or his proof or his test. All of these words would be fine for when something is true. It's true when you perceive it clearly and distinctly, CDP. So I should hold off from making a judgment when I do not have a CDP. Descartes says, what is improper, what I do not recommend you do, is when you assert or deny something, when you claim to know something without a clear and distinct perception, because you do not clearly and distinctly perceive something that is true in this situation. It is your will that is pushing you to assert or deny this thing when you don't really have enough evidence to do so. Descartes also will describe another type of situation we should avoid, something else that is improper. He says getting lucky and just guessing correctly. We should also try to avoid these sorts of situations, or at least avoid calling these good, proper knowledge. Why? Well, Descartes says that a perception on the part of your mind, on the part of your intellect, should always precede a determination on the part of the will. And you'll notice that I already corrected there the language. In the book it says a perception on the part of the intellect must always precede. But really what he means here is should. What he means is you should have enough evidence before you decide that you're right? You shouldn't claim to be right and then look for the evidence later once someone pushes you for details or asks you why you think you're right, asks you what your argument is. Again, a perception on the part of the intellect, a clear and distinct perception on the part of the intellect, should always come before a determination on the part of the will, right? A situation where you decide if you're right or wrong, a situation where you make that crucial judgment. So the end of this meditation culminates with several paragraphs of basically apologies in a philosophical sense, not in a sense of saying I'm sorry. I just mean answering various problems that have historically been pushed towards the Catholic Church. And we won't really focus so much on these comments. They're very technical. They're kind of more theological and scriptural than they are philosophical. So I always just sort of skip over this part. It's not really anything that we need for the main argument in this text. So you don't need to focus on these comments as much as you do the rest of the material in this chapter. And with that, we are done with the fourth meditation.